We often want to ensure we are doing everything possible to build muscle at the fastest rate, but in most cases we likely aren't maximizing our muscle growth potential. There are almost always ways to manipulate training and diet to improve our rate of muscle growth. But what is our maximal rate of muscle growth? How do we even know if we are leaving gains on the table, and how can we increase our rate of muscle growth? First, let's explore what a maximal rate of muscle growth looks like. Well, this is extremely difficult to quantify or define since it is a hypothetical concept. There is no true way to know what your maximal muscle growth potential is at the current point in time. A vague definition for this term could be the maximum potential rate of muscle growth when all training and nutrition variables are optimized for muscle building purposes. However, the issue with this definition is that we don't know what the exact optimal ways are to train and eat for muscle growth. This is an open-ended topic that constantly evolves as we understand more and more about lifting over time. So what is considered optimal today may not be considered optimal in a few years' time. Furthermore, the maximum rate of muscle growth we can achieve at any given time differs based on two factors, which are outside our control. The first is our training status. In other words, how close we currently are to our maximum muscular potential. There isn't really a single way to define this, but we can get an idea of our training status using two metrics. First is how long we have been lifting for. Someone who has been consistently resistance training for a longer duration is more likely to be of a higher training status. And second is how fast we are able to achieve lifting performance increases. Someone of a lower training status may be able to improve performance every time they repeat the same workout, whereas someone of a higher training status may not be able to make objective performance gains for multiple months or even years. So essentially, the maximum rate of muscle growth someone is able to achieve is going to be different for people of different training statuses. A more advanced lifter can't build muscle at the same rate as a less experienced lifter, even if the same training and nutrition protocols are implemented. And the other factor that influences our maximum rate of muscle growth is our individual response to training. Some people naturally respond better to resistance training than others. For example, this study compared the individual responses to the same 12-week bicep curl training protocol in over 500 untrained subjects. It was found that most people saw around a 10 to 20% increase in biceps cross-sectional area, although a small sample of people saw no increases at all, and others saw more than a 50% increase. So even when training status is the same and the training protocol is the same, we still can observe large variability in muscle growth between people. And this responsiveness is probably just due to our genetic makeup, so we can't really change it. So if you are someone who is highly responsive to resistance training, your maximum rate of muscle growth will probably be greater, whereas someone who is less responsive may have a lower maximum rate of muscle growth. Now that we have discussed our hypothetical maximum rate of muscle growth, let's explore what training variables we can use to try and build muscle at the fastest rate possible. We are going to discuss a few primary training variables and how they can be manipulated to maximize the hypertrophic stimulus. The first of which is proximity to failure. This refers to how close each set is taken to failure. Essentially, training to or very close to failure seems to be beneficial for muscle growth in general. This meta-regression explored the relationship between proximity to failure and muscle growth using the entire body of evidence. It was found that training closer to failure generally has a positive effect on muscle growth. We are able to build muscle with several reps in reserve, but training very close to failure seems to result in superior muscle growth. Furthermore, it may be additionally beneficial to train beyond failure in some cases. This seems to be the case for exercises where we are able to perform additional partial reps in the lengthened range after reaching failure with a full range of motion. For example, we can usually perform additional lengthened partials during rows and pull downs after reaching failure using a full range of motion. This study compared the effects of performing calf raises with either a standard full range of motion to failure with one leg and performing additional lengthened partial reps after reaching full range failure with the other leg. It was found that the leg performing post-failure reps achieved slightly superior growth compared with the standard training leg. So to ensure we aren't leaving any gains on the table, we probably want to make sure we are training to or very close to failure on every set of every exercise. And for some exercises, we may need to train beyond failure to truly maximize the stimulus of each set. The other primary variable influencing muscle growth is volume. This refers to the total number of sets a muscle group is trained with per week. Similar to proximity to failure, higher training volumes typically produce superior muscle growth, although the dose-response relationship looks a little different compared with proximity to failure. This meta-regression explored the relationship between volume and muscle growth using the entire body of evidence. It was found that training with higher volumes generally produce greater muscle growth, and this relationship seems to continue beyond training a muscle with 30 sets per week. However, there seems to be somewhat of a diminishing returns response where more volume results in slightly less additional growth. So, what is the maximum amount of volume we can perform and still benefit from? Well, it seems that we haven't found this point yet. The highest volume study I am aware of is this one, which compared the effects of training the quadriceps with 3 different volume progressions. All groups started by training with 22 total weekly sets for the quads. One group maintained this training volume for 12 weeks. The second group increased volume by 4 sets every 2 weeks, ending with a total weekly volume of 42 weekly sets. And the third group increased volume by 6 sets every 2 weeks, ending with a total of 52 weekly sets. It was found that muscle thickness of the lateral quadriceps increased in all groups, with superior increases seen with higher volume training. So even when training a muscle group with more than 50 sets per week, we seem to see benefits. So to maximize our rate of muscle growth, we may need to train each muscle group with more than 30 or 40 sets per week. Next, let's discuss rest periods between sets. Significant muscle growth can be achieved with any rest period duration. However, slightly longer rest periods seem to be a little more favorable for muscle growth on a per set basis. This was seen in this meta-analysis, which compared the influence of rest period durations on muscle growth across the entire body of evidence. It was found that significant muscle growth is able to be achieved with any rest period duration. However, moderate and longer rest periods tend to promote slightly superior muscle growth. So to maximize the per set hypertrophic stimulus, it seems that we would want to rest for around 2 minutes or longer. And for some free weight compound lifts that are highly fatiguing, we may need to rest even longer, maybe 3 to 4 minutes to maximize the hypertrophic stimulus. And lastly, let's discuss frequency. By this we are referring to how many times per week each muscle group is trained. Frequency is essentially just how we distribute our volume. If the same volume is performed across more workouts per week, we perform less volume per workout. If our frequency is lower, more volume will be performed within each workout. For example, if we were to train the quads 2 times per week with 6 total sets per session, our total weekly volume would be 12 sets. Alternatively, we could train the quads with 4 sets per session 3 times per week, which would also be a total of 12 sets. So the question is it better to train a muscle less frequently with more sets per session, or more frequently with fewer sets per session? This idea was explored in this meta-regression, which explored the relationship between per set volume and hypertrophy. It was found that, like the evidence on volume, training a muscle group with more sets within a workout typically produces superior muscle growth. However, there seems to be a diminishing returns response where more per session volume is less additionally beneficial. And it seems that significant diminishing returns start to exist when training a muscle group with more than around 10 sets within a single workout. So practically speaking, when training a muscle group with more than around 10 sets within a single workout, it would likely be beneficial to increase frequency. In other words, take the same volume, but perform some of those sets on another day. For example, if the chest was trained with 12 sets in a single workout, it would likely be slightly better to rearrange your workout plan to train the chest with 6 sets twice per week. So to ensure we aren't leaving any gains on the table, we would probably need to train every day. This is because the extreme volumes required for each muscle group would want to be distributed throughout the week so that we aren't training a muscle with more than around 10 sets within a single workout. Now let's move on to some nutrition variables. There are 2 primary nutrition variables that can be manipulated to maximize our rate of muscle growth. The first is protein intake. Consuming a high-protein diet in combination with resistance training is generally beneficial for muscle growth. But how much protein do we need to maximize muscle growth? We have two meta-analyses which can help us to answer this question. First is this meta-analysis, which found that overall, higher protein intakes tend to result in greater muscle growth from resistance training. However, a breakpoint analysis found that increasing protein intake was more effective when consuming less than around 1.3 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, but had less additional benefit when total daily intake was greater than this. Furthermore, this meta-regression found that protein supplementation had a positive effect for increasing fat-free mass when total daily protein intake was less than around 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. However, when total daily intake was greater than this, there was no clear relationship. So overall, I would hypothesize that the relationship between protein intake and muscle growth looks something like this. Higher protein intakes are generally favorable, but likely have diminishing returns. Once we consume more than around 1.5 grams per kilogram per day of protein, the additional benefits of higher protein intakes seem to be minimal. So although there is little additional benefit, we probably need to be consuming at least around 3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day to maximize our rate of muscle growth. And the other nutrition variable to consider is our energy balance state. In other words, are we eating in a surplus, deficit, or at maintenance? Unfortunately, there isn't much direct evidence investigating this topic in combination with resistance training that we can draw from. However, indirect evidence suggests that gaining weight is beneficial for absolute gains in lean mass. Heavier individuals typically carry more absolute lean mass than lighter individuals, although they also typically have a greater percentage of body fat too. For example, this study compared body compositions between sumo wrestlers, bodybuilders, and untrained men. As expected, sumo wrestlers were the heaviest. However, they also had on average 10 kilograms more lean mass than the bodybuilders, although their body fat was also significantly higher. In another example, this study compared body compositions between Division I college football players. It was found that linemen were the heaviest, while skill positions were the lightest. The linemen also had the greatest total lean mass, although they also had the highest body fat percentage too. And this study found that at a population level, heavier individuals generally have more muscle mass than lighter individuals in both men and women. Although heavier individuals also have a lower percentage of muscle mass as a proportion of body weight, indicating that they carry more body fat. So what this suggests is that weight gain, in combination with resistance training, will likely result in the greatest amount of total muscle gain. So if we truly wanted to maximize our rate of muscle growth, we probably want to eat in a calorie surplus for an extended period of time. But as we have seen, this will usually result in substantial fat gain too. And ultimately, this isn't really the end goal for most people. Most people are more concerned with the proportion of muscle mass they carry at a given body weight, not the absolute amount. So excessive weight gain probably isn't ideal for this goal, as we will likely gain substantial body fat. Furthermore, it is unclear at this stage if bulking followed by cutting will result in net more muscle growth compared with maintaining body weight. So taking all this information, what does the optimal training and diet routine look like? Well, essentially, we would need to do the following to maximize our rate of muscle growth. Train each major muscle group with at least 30 to 40 sets per week. To accommodate this without performing more than 10 sets in a single workout for any muscle group, we would probably need to train every day and possibly even multiple times per day. Take each set to failure and past failure for some exercises where it is viable. Rest for at least 2 minutes between sets. Consume at least 3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. And eat in a calorie surplus for an extended period of time to gain substantial body weight. Here is an example training routine I have created which accounts for all these factors. This program trains each major muscle group with around 30 to 40 sets each, which is on the lower end of what we would consider optimal. I have calculated each workout to take approximately 2 hours each, which only accounts for the sets and strict rest periods. In reality, if we include the commute to and from the gym, warm-up, and time spent waiting for equipment or chatting to other people, the actual time spent may be more like 2.5 to 3 hours. So unless your training routine looks similar to this, you are probably leaving some amount of gains on the table. So while this routine may be theoretically required to maximize our rate of muscle growth, it may not be ideal in reality. This routine is probably not realistic for the vast majority of people. This is because we will likely be constrained by some other factors before we are able to do such an extreme routine. Here are a few factors which could limit us before we reach our maximum potential rate of muscle growth. The first and most obvious is time. Most people have other commitments in their busy lives which take up time in their day. Things such as work, school, relationships, parenting, other hobbies, time to relax, and so on all take up time. This may not leave us enough time to realistically complete such an intense training routine. And as we have seen, the amount of volume required to maximize muscle growth will probably require multiple hours of training per day, which we might not have the time for. Of course, you could say that time isn't actually the limitation, it is just priorities. And that is true. But for most people, maximizing our theoretical rate of muscle growth isn't the highest priority in our lives. Most people aren't going to rearrange their entire lives just to make time to train for multiple hours each day. So practically speaking, time ends up being a limitation for many people. The second potential constraint is the effort it takes to perform such an intense training and diet schedule. Even if we have the time to do so, it is simply tough to complete. Concentrating on putting maximal effort into every set for multiple hours per day can be taxing. This can leave us physically and psychologically fatigued, leaving little energy to perform other tasks required for the day. And in terms of diet, you will need to be very particular about food choices to ensure protein intake is high enough. This can impact our relationships and our ability to socialize due to the strictness of the diet. Many people probably wouldn't want to put this much time and effort into their training and diet regardless of how much time they have. We would probably want to spend our mental energy on other things that are more important in our lives, like relationships, family, work, school, other hobbies, and so on. So again, this can be a factor that limits our willingness to maximize our rate of muscle growth. And finally, even if we have the time and we have the willingness to put in the effort, we may not be able to complete the required work because of joint stress. Performing so much volume with a high intensity may simply be too much to handle for certain joints and connective tissue. Even if our muscles are able to recover and benefit from the training, our joints and connective tissue may not be able to tolerate it. That being said, there are ways to mitigate joint stress to some extent. Factors like slowly increasing volume over time, using lighter loads with higher rep ranges, avoiding high-stress exercises, ensuring appropriate lifting technique, and so on, can mitigate joint stress to some extent. But there is inevitably a breaking point where we simply need to do less total workload. So ultimately, I don't think it makes sense to think about trying to maximize our rate of muscle growth at all costs. Instead, it makes more sense to understand the potential trade-offs we are making with every training and diet decision. And we can then make informed decisions as to whether a certain training or diet intervention is a good idea. For the most part, the amount of time and effort we put into training and nutrition has diminishing returns with regards to muscle growth. A little effort goes a long way, and the more we put in, the less additional benefit we get. So we may put a moderate amount of effort and get the majority of potential gains possible. Yes, we are technically leaving some gains on the table, but to achieve those extra gains may not be worth the investment. For example, let's compare the two training and diet routines. In the first example, let's say we train each important muscle group with around 15 sets per week. We rest 1 to 2 minutes between sets. We train 4 days per week for around 60 minutes per workout. We consume 1.5 grams per kilogram of protein per day, and we aim to maintain body weight within a healthy range. In the second example, we perform 30 sets for each important muscle group. We rest for 2 to 3 minutes between sets. This requires us to train 6 days per week, with each session lasting 2 hours. We consume 3 grams per kilogram of protein per day, and we eat in a surplus, gaining substantial body weight over time. In the second example, we are essentially leaving minimal gains on the table. However, we are probably able to build muscle at around 70 to 80% of the same rate following the first example, with substantially less time and effort. This gives us more time and mental energy to spend on other important aspects of life. We will likely have a lower prevalence of joint and connective tissue pain or irritation. We can maintain a leaner and healthy body fat percentage too. And our diet is less restrictive, allowing us to enjoy our food more and eat socially. Where exactly you fall on this spectrum is totally up to you. Some people may want to push close to the optimal routine. But for the vast majority of people, we are probably more concerned with implementing an efficient routine, where we achieve a good rate of muscle growth with substantially less time and effort. So taking all this into consideration, let's summarize what we have discussed. First of all, there is no universal consensus as to the optimal training and diet strategies to maximize our rate of muscle growth. We also can't really quantify this as it is different for each individual based on genetics and training status. Generally speaking, to maximize our rate of muscle growth, we would want to train in the following ways. Take each set to failure and potentially beyond failure for relevant exercises. Perform very high volumes for each muscle group, in excess of around 30 to 40 sets per week. Rest between sets for at least 2 minutes. Distribute our workload in a way that avoids training a muscle group with more than around 10 sets per workout. And in terms of nutritional variables, we would want to consume more than around 3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. And we would want to eat in a calorie surplus and gain significant body weight over time to maximize absolute lean mass gains. However, this optimal training and diet routine is simply not feasible for the majority of people. This is because we will be limited by either the time requirements, the effort it takes, or joint stress from the high volume of training. So ultimately, we should probably be more concerned with making training and diet decisions based on trade-offs. In other words, is the time and effort worth the additional muscle growth benefits? Or are the small additional gains not worth the substantially greater investment? Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.